Hi there, it's Mrs. Scarple, and we're going to solve a different kind of equation in this video. We're going to solve absolute value equations. And what makes an equation an absolute value equation is that it contains an absolute value in expression. So an absolute value expression contains a variable inside the absolute value. That's what makes it an absolute value expression. So I have on this slide three very simple, very basic absolute value equations. But before we solve them, we have to remember that the definition of absolute value is the distance from zero on the number line. So on each of these number lines, I'm going to put 0. Because we're going to have to think about what numbers are that many units away from 0 in order to solve my equation. If I look at the first equation, what values of x would satisfy the equation the absolute value of x equals 4? So I need a number that is going to be 4 units away in either direction from 0. So if each of these are 1 unit, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. When x is 4, and when x is -4, because that's another 1, 2, 3, 4 units away from 0, we actually have 2 answers. So we have x equals 4 as a solution, but we also have x equals -4. Now, because these numbers are opposites, you may see them written as x equals plus or minus 4 as one answer like that. But what that expression means is x equals 4 and x equals -4. For the second equation, we have absolute value of x equals 0. Well, I want to be 0 units away from 0. Well, the only value that works for is 0. So in this case, we only have one solution, and that's x equals 0. And then our third equation is absolute value of x equals -7. But we just said in the definition is that absolute value is a distance, and distance isn't negative, because if we think about it, we don't say that the distance between two cities is -150 miles. We would say that the distance between two cities is 150 miles. We don't say the distance between classrooms is -25 feet. We would say the distance between classrooms is a positive 25 feet. So when it comes to absolute value equals a negative, we don't have a distance that's -7 units away from 0. So in this case, what we have is no solution, because absolute value cannot equal 0. So when we're solving absolute value equations, we're either going to have 2 solutions, 1 solution, or no solution, based upon what the absolute value equals. So let's take a look at some equations. In the first equation, we have absolute value of x plus 6 equals 11. Keep in mind, x plus 6 represents a value. Some value is 11 units away from 0. Well, I know 11 is 11 units away from 0, so that tells me that x plus 6 could be 11. But I also know if I were to go the other direction on the number line, that x plus 6 could be -11. So I need to solve both of these equations. So I'm going to subtract 6 from each side of each equation. So in the first equation, we have x equals 5. And in the second equation, we have x equals -17. Now, let's just mentally check this. If x is 5, 5 plus 6 is 11. Is the absolute value of 11 11? Yes, it is. It's 11 units away from 0. If x is -17, negative 17 plus 6 is negative 11. The absolute value of negative 11, the distance negative 11 is from 0, is 11 units. So both of these work. Both of those are solutions. The second equation is absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals negative 4. I just said absolute value equals negative, but the definition is that absolute value is a distance which is positive. I do not need to go any further. My solution to this problem is that there is no solution. And I'm just going to make another note, because absolute value cannot be negative. And let's take a look at the third equation. We have absolute value of 3x minus 2 equals 0. Well, there's only one number that's 0 units away from 0, and that one number is 0. So our only equation to solve is 3x minus 2 equals 0. I'm going to add 2 to each side of the equation. So 3x equals 2. Divide both sides by 3, and x equals 2/3. Now, because my answer turned out to be a rational number or a fraction, I'm going to go ahead and take the time to check this. I'm pretty sure I solved it correctly, but it doesn't hurt. So, is 3 times 2/3 subtract 2, is the absolute value of that going to equal 0? Well, when I take 3 times 2/3, that's 3 times 2 and divide by 3. So 3 times 2 is 6, divide by 3 is 2. So is the absolute value of 2 subtract 2 going to equal 0? 2 subtract 2 is 0. So is the absolute value of 0 going to equal 0? Well, 0 is 0 units away from 0, and that does equal 0. That's true. So our solution is 2/3. So what I would like you to do now is solve these three equations. Now that you've solved these three equations, let's check to see if you have the correct answers. Absolute value of x equals 10. So just like the very basic ones we had at the beginning, there are two values that are 10 units away from 0, and that would be 10 and negative 10, and there isn't anything more to simplify with that expression. So that is our answer. B, we have absolute value of x minus 1 equals a positive 4. There are two numbers that are 4 units away from 0 on the number line, 4 and negative 4. So you should start by writing two equations. X minus 1 can equal 4, and x minus 1 can equal negative 4. Solve each of those equations by adding 1 to each side, and you should have x equals 5 and x equals negative 3. And for the final equation, we have absolute value of 3 plus x equals negative 3. Again, absolute value equals negative 3, but by definition, absolute value cannot be negative, so there is no solution because absolute value cannot equal a negative value. But what if it isn't just an absolute value on one side of the equation? What if something's being done to that absolute value? What should we do first? First thing we should do is isolate, I'm going to put that in all caps because it's very important, isolate the absolute value. Meaning you need to get the absolute value by itself on one side of the equation before you do anything else, before you write two equations, before you determine if it's even possible. Because a common mistake I've seen students make with a problem like example 2 is, oh, I have an absolute value, my equation equals a negative, no solution, done. But that's not necessarily the case because of this 9 being subtracted from the absolute value. So we have to check to see what that minus 9 does to the problem. So if I add 9 to each side so that I isolate the absolute value, I have absolute value of 3x minus 6 equals a positive 6. Now that can happen. There are two numbers that have an absolute value of positive 6. 6 and negative 6. So I'm going to solve the equation 3x minus 6 equals 6. And I'm going to solve the equation 3x minus 6 equals negative 6. In each case, I'm going to have to add 6 to each side. 3x equals 12 with the first equation. Divide each side by 3. And I have x equals 4 as a possible solution. Second equation, when I add the 6, I have negative 6 plus 6. So that tells me 3x equals 0. Now don't stop there. Just because 3x equals 0 doesn't mean it's not possible to solve. We can divide by 3. It's 0 we can't divide by, but we can divide by 3. And 0 divided by anything is 0. And we can check our answers. So 3 times 4 is 12. Subtract 6 is 6, and the absolute value of 6 is 6. 6 subtract 9 is negative 3, so x equals 4 works. Substitute 0, 3 times 0 is 0, so we're left with minus 6. Absolute value of minus 6 is 6. 6 subtract 9 again is negative 3. Whenever you check your answers, make sure you're checking with the original problem. So here are two more problems for you to try. Keep in mind the first thing you want to do is isolate the absolute value. Now that you've had an opportunity to solve these, here's what your work should have looked like. For equation A, you should have divided by 4 first, so that you would have absolute value of 2x plus 7 equals 4. Then you can write the two equations, one set equal to positive 4, one set equal to negative 4. In each equation, you would have to subtract 7 before you did anything else. And then you would divide by 2. And your solution is x equals negative 3 halves, x equals negative 11 halves. For equation B, you would first want to add the 3. You want to undo that subtraction first. So we have negative 2 times the absolute value of 5x minus 1 equals negative 8. Then divide both sides by negative 2 to isolate that absolute value. And when we divide negative 8 by negative 2, we get a positive 4. Therefore, we do have two equations we can solve. Add 1 to each side. Divide both sides by 5, and our solutions are 1 and 3/5. So when you're solving absolute value equations, you need to make sure absolute value is completely by itself before you write separate equations and solve. That must be done first. Isolate the absolute value and then write your two equations.